Johnny Carson stopped mid-joke. A soldier stood up in the back of the audience. And Johnny couldn't finish his sentence. The Tonight Show. Studio 6B at NBC in Burbank. March 1978. Another Tuesday night. Another monologue. Johnny was in the middle of a bit about gas prices. Something light, something easy, the kind of observational humor that had made him king of late night for 16 years. The audience was laughing. Ed McMahon was chuckling at his desk. Doc Severinsen and the band were ready with the bumper music. Everything was running like clockwork, the well-oiled machine of American television's most successful late-night show. Johnny was mid-punchline when he saw movement in the audience. Someone standing up. Not unusual. Sometimes people needed to leave, use the restroom, whatever. But something about this movement made Johnny's eyes track toward it. A man stood in the 7th row. Early 30s. Military dress uniform. U.S. Army. The olive green jacket. The medals. The garrison cap held respectfully at his waist. Johnny's voice stopped. The words just stopped. His hand froze mid-gesture. The smile left his face. The audience noticed immediately. The laughter died like someone had cut a wire. 300 people suddenly confused, turning to look at what Johnny was seeing. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. The soldier wasn't doing anything aggressive. He wasn't shouting or interrupting. He was just standing there, at attention, looking directly at Johnny Carson with an expression that Johnny recognized instantly because he'd seen it before. On his son's face. On the faces in photographs. On the faces of boys who'd gone to a war that America was still trying to forget. Johnny slowly lowered his cue cards. He looked at Ed, who had also spotted the soldier, and had gone completely still. Then Johnny looked at Doc, gave him a small signal. Cut the music, cut everything. The studio fell into absolute silence. "Sir?" Johnny said, his voice different now, no trace of the monologue persona. "Are you okay?" The soldier's jaw clenched. He nodded once, sharp, military. But his eyes told a different story. Johnny took a step away from his desk. "What's your name?" The soldier's voice was quiet but steady. "Corporal James Whitfield, sir. 1st Cavalry Division. I served 2 tours in Vietnam." A ripple went through the audience. This was 1978. 3 years after the fall of Saigon, 3 years since the last helicopters left the embassy roof, 3 years since America had tried to move on and forget. But you couldn't forget the men who'd come home. And you especially couldn't forget the ones who hadn't. Johnny walked to the edge of the stage. "Why are you standing, Corporal?" James Whitfield's composure cracked just slightly. "Because you made a joke about gas prices, Mr. Carson." And I remembered. I remembered standing in line for gas in 1975 when I got back. I was wearing this same uniform. And people spit on me. The studio went dead silent. I was 19 years old. James continued, his voice shaking now. I'd been home for 6 days. I was trying to fill up my dad's car. And a man walked up to me and called me a baby killer and spit in my face. And everyone in that gas station just watched. Nobody said anything. Nobody helped. They just let it happen. Johnny stood at the edge of the stage, his hands at his sides, completely still. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphones caught every word. "I'm sorry," Johnny said. "I'm so sorry that happened to you. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad," James said quickly. "I'm telling you because I've watched your show every night since I got back. Every single night for 3 years. And you never made us feel like monsters. You never treated Vietnam vets like we were the enemy. And I needed you to know that mattered. That it still matters." Johnny's eyes were glistening. He nodded slowly, unable to speak for a moment. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Johnny Carson was in 1978. And more importantly, who'd he been in 1968? Johnny Carson had a son named Rick, his middle child. Rick Carson enlisted in the Navy in 1968, at the height of the Vietnam War. He was 20 years old. He wanted to serve. Johnny had been terrified, but proud. He never talked about it publicly. Johnny kept his family life intensely private, but everyone who knew him knew he lived in constant fear during those years. Rick served on a destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin. He came home in 1970, physically unharmed but changed in ways Johnny recognized but couldn't quite reach. They'd never been particularly close. Johnny's work schedule, the divorce from Rick's mother, the distance that fame creates. But after Vietnam, there was something else between them. A wall Johnny didn't know how to break down. Johnny had watched his son struggle to readjust. Watched him flinch at loud noises. Watched him unable to talk about what he'd seen. Watched America treat returning veterans like embarrassments to be hidden away and forgotten. In 1971, Johnny did something quiet. He started making calls. He used his influence, and Johnny Carson in 1971 had more influence than almost anyone in America, to help fund a small veterans counseling center in Los Angeles. He never put his name on it. Never took credit. Just wrote checks and made phone calls and helped it stay open. Over the next 7 years, Johnny had probably helped hundreds of Vietnam veterans through that center. Most of them never knew it was him. That's how he wanted it. But tonight, standing on his stage, looking at Corporal James Whitfield standing at attention in row 7, Johnny felt something break open inside him. All the worry he'd carried for Rick. All the helplessness he'd felt watching his son hurt in ways he couldn't fix. All the rage at an America that had sent boys to war, and then spit on them when they came home. Johnny made a decision. He walked off the stage. Not back to his desk. Off the stage entirely, down the steps, into the audience. The cameras scrambled to follow him. The director in the control room was screaming into headsets. Ed McMahon stood up from his desk, not knowing what to do. Doc Severinsen gripped his trumpet tighter. Johnny walked up the aisle to row 7. He stood in front of Corporal James Whitfield. The two men looked at each other. "At ease, Corporal," Johnny said quietly. James relaxed his posture slightly but kept his eyes on Johnny. "How long have you been home?" Johnny asked. 3 years, 2 months, sir. You call me Johnny. And I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you okay? Really okay? James Whitfield's face crumpled. Just for a second, the military bearing collapsed and Johnny saw the scared kid underneath. "No, sir. No, I'm not." Johnny put his hand on James's shoulder. "Come with me." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny led James Whitfield onto the Tonight Show stage. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay silent, so they did both, a smattering of uncertain clapping that faded quickly. Johnny gestured to the guest chair, the chair where celebrities sat, where movie stars promoted their films, where comedians told stories. "Sit," Johnny said. James sat down stiffly, his garrison cap still in his hands, looking completely overwhelmed. Johnny sat in his desk chair, not behind the desk but turned to face James directly. "Folks," Johnny said, addressing the studio audience and the millions watching at home, "we're going to do something different tonight. This is Corporal James Whitfield. He served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division. And we're going to talk to him." The control room was in chaos. Producer Fred de Cordova was gesturing frantically. This wasn't in the schedule. They had celebrity guests waiting backstage. They had commercial breaks timed to the second. They had a format. Johnny ignored all of it. "James," Johnny said, "tell me about your service. Where were you deployed?" And James Whitfield started talking. He talked about landing in Da Nang in 1969. About the heat and the fear and the confusion. About the friends he'd made. About the village they tried to protect. About the firefight where his sergeant had died in his arms. About the long flight home where nobody spoke and everyone stared at nothing. He talked about arriving at Travis Air Force Base in California and being told to change out of his uniform before leaving the base because it wasn't safe to wear it in public. About his father picking him up and driving in silence all the way home. About his mother crying when she saw him but not knowing what to say. He talked about the nightmares. The unemployment. The people who crossed the street to avoid him when they saw his uniform. The job interviews that ended when they learned he was a veteran. The isolation. Johnny listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to lighten the mood. He just listened with the complete attention he usually reserved for the biggest stars, and he let this corporal from the 1st Cavalry Division tell his story on national television. Ed McMahon was crying openly at his desk. Doc Severinsen had put down his trumpet. The audience sat in reverent silence. When James finally stopped talking, his voice hoarse, Johnny reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a business card and a pen. "James," Johnny said, "I'm going to give you an address. It's a counseling center here in Los Angeles. They specialize in helping veterans. I want you to go there. Tomorrow. Will you do that for me?" James took the card with shaking hands. "Yes, sir. Johnny." Johnny smiled, a real smile, not the TV smile. "Good. And James, I want you to know something. What happened to you at that gas station, that man who spit on you, he doesn't speak for America. He doesn't speak for me. And he sure as hell doesn't speak for anyone in this studio." The audience erupted. Standing ovation. Not the excited applause of entertainment, but the fierce, emotional applause of people who needed to hear someone say that out loud. Johnny stood up and extended his hand. James stood as well, snapping briefly to attention before remembering Johnny's earlier instruction and relaxing. They shook hands. And then Johnny did something that would be replayed on news programs for weeks. He pulled James into a brief embrace, a gesture so un-Johnny-like, so breaking of his usual emotional reserve, that it made clear this wasn't show business. This was personal. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. After the show went to commercial, Johnny kept James on stage. The producers were begging to get back on schedule, but Johnny waved them off. "Do you have family here?" Johnny asked. "My parents are in the audience," James said. "They're the ones who won tickets. I came with them." "Show me." James pointed to an older couple in row 4. The man was crying. The woman had her hand over her mouth. Johnny walked down into the audience again. He approached James's parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield," Johnny said, "your son is a hero. I need you to know that. And I need you to help him. He's struggling. He needs support. Can you do that?" James's father stood up, tears streaming down his face. "We didn't know how. We didn't know what to say. Say that you're proud. Say that you're there. Say it every day until he believes it." Johnny looked back at James, still standing on stage, and then back at his parents. He served his country. Now his country needs to serve him. The audience was on their feet again, applauding and crying. The show ended 20 minutes late that night. Johnny never got to his celebrity guest. The scheduled comedy bits didn't happen. The Tonight Show completely abandoned its format. And the network got 10,000 letters in the next week. All of them saying the same thing: thank you. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Johnny Carson kept in touch with James Whitfield. The counseling center Johnny had recommended? James went the next day. He got help. He got better. Not overnight, not completely, but better. 3 years later, James Whitfield got married. Johnny sent flowers. 5 years later, James became a counselor himself, helping other veterans. Johnny quietly helped fund the program. The business card Johnny handed James that night? James had it framed. It hangs in his office to this day, where he meets with veterans who still struggle to come home. That night changed the Tonight Show. After that, Johnny never shied away from serious moments. He used his platform differently. And veterans knew they had an ally. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. In 1992, when Johnny Carson did his final Tonight Show, James Whitfield was in the audience. Johnny saw him, nodded once, and James nodded back. No words needed. The war had tried to break them both. But that night in 1978, they'd helped each other remember how to be human. Johnny Carson taught America to laugh. But that night, he taught them something more important: how to listen.